All right, salamat everyone. Welcome. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian from Gaza, and I'd like to welcome you today to this exciting conversation with our guest, Professor Haim Bresheeth-Zabner. Today's session is titled Zionism, Origins, Goals, and Influence, the Weaponization of Jewish Trauma and Anti-Semitism in the Service of Apartheid and Empire. This national webinar is hosted by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and Free Palestine Melbourne. It is also endorsed by other organizations across the continent. Before I introduce our guest, Professor Haim, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are dialing in today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I acknowledge that we're dialing in today from ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. Again, I would like to welcome everyone who is joining us today, including those who are probably joining us from the dark side. In particular, for those guests, I should say that all opinions expressed by myself today represent my own personal views as a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to live on this colony and who happened to have his family enduring the past 15 months of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And everything I say should not be construed or misconstrued as me using any authority or agency bestowed upon me as part of my workplace. I am delighted today to be in conversation with Professor Haim Bresheeth-Zabner. Professor Haim is an anti-Zionist Israeli Jew based in the UK, a filmmaker, photographer, and a film studies scholar. After having taught at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London since early 2002. He retired and is now a professional research associate there. Professor Haim authored a few books, including An Army Like No Other, How the Israel Defense Force Made a Nation. Professor Haim, welcome to the conversation, and thank you so much for joining us today all the way from the UK, too early in the morning now.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be with you this morning.
It's all our pleasure. Thank you. Professor Haim, we have recently been hearing the following statement over and over again in the Australian media and probably also in the British media, that anti-Semitism is on the rise. There was an article written in The Conversation in November 2024 about this very topic. Quote, the rise in anti-Semitic incidents is supported by data from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, ECAJ. It recorded 495 incidents from October 2022 to September 2023. An alarming increase is projected this year, that is 2024, with more than 1,800 incidents expected October 2023 to October 2024. End of quote. Now, I'm going to make a couple of statements and we can unpack them as we go through the first couple of questions. First of all, the data and those numbers coming out of the ECAJ might have to be taken with a huge grain of salt. But generally speaking, it is very well established and normalized that hate and criticism of Judaism as a religion and of the Jewish people solely for being Jewish is a form of blatant act of racism and anti-Semitism and is to be unequivocally rejected and combated. Now, there are attempts made to normalize and equate Zionism with Judaism. Superficially, on the outside, Zionists claim that Zionism was created as a direct reaction to anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe, historically speaking. Its core claim thesis is to combat anti-Semitism by establishing a Jewish home state for all Jews across the world in Palestine, whereby they will eternally be protected and saved from another hate-induced crimes, the likes of pogroms experienced in Europe and another Holocaust. These pursuits of the Zionist movement have eventually culminated in the establishment of the State of Israel, of course, with the help of Western powers at the time. Zionism also claims to be Jewish at core, invoking religion to justify its end goals. Now, on the face of it, everything I said so far sounds pretty benevolent and possibly noble, to a certain audience. So to that end, I want to start by asking you this question. Is this truly the core thesis of Zionism? I mean, has Zionism been an effective tool in combating anti-Semitism, or is it in general an effective tool in combating anti-Semitism, given the current statistics of the rise of anti-Semitism? And I mean, if you could also point out for us, how attached is Zionism to Judaism and to the State of Israel? Because many anti-Zionists, Jewish or otherwise, are being criticized and accused of being anti-Semites. And much of that rise in anti-Semitism may very well be linked to anti-Israel sentiments. So I know there's a lot of questions, but I usually like to start by many questions. So if you could help us unpack these questions.
Well, how many days do we have? I mean, you're covering the ground that my last book and my new book are concentrating on. So this is a huge bunch of questions. Now, first of all, about the origins of Zionism and its effectivity in combating anti-Semitism. Until the beginning of the State of Israel, until its 1948 appearance, after the UN has decided to divide Palestine, the worst decision taken by the UN in its 80 years history. The percentage of Jews supporting Zionism in Europe, and I'll come to the Arab world in a minute, but the percentage, the average was between 1 and 1.5% of Jews supporting Zionism in its first 50 years of being. Now, if indeed Zionism was an effective tool, or indeed a tool at all against anti-Semitism, I should think that the percentages would be in the 90s, not 1%. So Jews, on the whole, were not confused by Zionism, did not support it, and actually feared it. The only Jewish member of the British cabinet in 1915, Lord Montagu, said that Zionism is a dangerous, and called it even worse names, it's a dangerous political development because it will present the Jews of Britain, which have been there for 400 to 500 years at the time, as people who belong to another nation, and therefore will enhance anti-Semitism. So that understanding was shared by Jews all over Europe. They didn't want Zionism, they didn't need it, and it threatened them because it actually claimed that they don't belong to where they are living. So that's the first thing. The biggest movement in political Judaism, or in the Jewish political scene in Europe, and especially in Eastern Europe, was the Bund. The Bund was a Russian and Polish in its origin, but the whole of Eastern Europe was influenced and by the rising of the Bund. Actually, at the same year, just by chance, I assume, that Theodor Herzl had his first Zionist Congress. So the Bund was a progressive, localized mainly, and very strong reaction to Zionist nationalism. The Bund claimed that Jews belong where they live, have to fight for the societies where they exist, and to the Bund was, of course, the Socialist Bund. That was its full name, and to work out with socialists and communists for a better society where they live. So that was, in a sense, the typical and the majority reaction to the end of the 19th century rise in anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism, a lot of Zionist historians claim that anti-Semitism is ahistorical. In other words, it existed always. This is nonsense. Of course, nations didn't exist always. They are basically a product of modernity. And anti-Semitism is a product of modernity, of the rising nationalisms in Europe around 1848 and following that. So, first of all, there were Judeophobic movements or incidents for a long time, indeed for hundreds of years. But they themselves could not be thought of as anti-Semitism. Some of the historians of anti-Semitism get really carried away and go back to about 500 years BC, when they say, where they say this is the beginning of anti-Semitism. It's total nonsense, yeah. Now, I'm talking about Europe when I'm talking about 1 to 1.5% of the Jewish population supporting Zionism. But in the Arab world, the percentage was even lower, if it is possible to measure it at all, because the Jews of Arabia, of the Middle East, North Africa, as far as India, Iran, Turkey, and parts of southern Europe, like Romania, Greece, etc., and of course, at some point in time, the Iberian Peninsula, where there were many Jews. The Jews in all those places have not suffered anti-Semitism in the way that the European Jews did. They were not limited in what they could do and in what they could work and they could own in the same way that the European Jews were. So Jews under Muslim rule had been as close to equality as any Jews in the pre-modern world ever had. So this is a very important thing to point out. Now, of course, only 10% of the Jewish diaspora was in the Islamic world. But some of this diaspora was the most important diaspora ever. For example, the Jews of Iraq were there near 3,000 years. They were there before the Arabs actually take over Iraq, and of course, well before the Muslims. So basically, the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Egypt, the Jews of Morocco, Algeria, Syria, of course, these were very ancient Jews. Of course, when we think about Muhammad in the Quran, the Jews are playing a very important part in the life of pre-Muslim Arabia, and also influenced they and their religion influenced, the creation of Islam. So there was what historians later called a convivencia. In other words, a coexistence of Jews, Muslims, and Arabs for thousands of years. The first Christian communities are in the Middle East, of course. They are mainly made up of Jews, like, Jesus himself was born a Jew and died a Jew. So Christianity and Islam, of course, are indebted to Judaism in certain respects, in certain important respects. For example, the ideas of social justice. And the three religions altogether are very important when the UN, for example, is coming to determine the rights of people, what rights should people have. And it goes to those religions and takes, what Jewish tradition through, for example, the prophets has defined as the rights of man, in the words of the UN at the time. So there is a tradition in the Middle East, in Arabia, and in West Asia and North Africa, which the Jews of Europe did not share. That is a tradition of living together for a very long time, of having the same or almost the same rights of the Muslims. And actually, if we look at Jews and Muslims and Christians in Al-Andalus, we see an amazing coming together culturally, linguistically, philosophically, artistically, any way you want, scientifically. The Jews and Muslims and Christians of the Convivencia Al-Andalus have created the basis on which the Renaissance would build later on and would be impossible without. So this is something very important when people are talking about anti-Semitism. They don't actually mean Europe, they mean Muslims. In Europe, that's how people are thinking, that anti-Semitism is a Muslim invention. This is, nothing could be further from the truth than that. There was no anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. And in many instances, this is also true today. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about anti-Semitism is something that develops with the Reconquista. The Reconquista of Spain has changed something very important, and I can't talk about it at great length, and you ask me very complex questions. But just to say that until the development of the religious Inquisition in Spain, hatred towards others was probably based in Christianity and its development since the Crusade. This is what happened when Christianity created the movement of taking over the Holy Land in the 10th and 11th century. And those movements were based on the difference in religion. In other words, Christianity looked at Muslims and Jews as others, as non-kosher, so to speak. I mean, they were really not halal, if you want. They were wrong. They did not belong, and one had to get rid of them, especially in the Holy Land. So what we're talking about is hatred, which is basically religiously fueled by Europeans. The Muslims and Jews did not share it on the whole. And what the development of the Inquisition did is changed it to blood. I have written a couple of articles about the origin of anti-Semitism, and this is what was, the purity of blood was the concept developed by the Inquisition, and the purity of blood moved the otherness from ideas like Christianity or Islam or Judaism to the blood. In other words, to the DNA in the language that we use today. In other words, you couldn't do anything about you were born Jewish or you were born Christian, and that was the end of it. So that's the difference. This is where anti-Semitism is arising from Christian radicalism in Spain that spread to the rest of Europe. And actually, when the SS in the 30s came to write its rules and regulations, it took quite a lot from the Inquisition basic rules. So this is one thing that we have to remember. And that's why Zionism has also never fought, never struggled against, never combated anti-Semitism. And Herzl, in the beginning of his diary, in the very beginning of his diary, sets up the scene. He says that anti-Semitism is our partner. Instead of fighting it, we should accept it. Now, that's a very important position to take in 1896. And of course, his diary would remain secret for an unknown for about 50 years. But once it's published, we can read his insights, and his insight was correct. Anti-Semitism is the best partner of Zionism because if the Jews are attacked, if they are discriminated against, then they would need to leave and come to Palestine. And that's what he was building on. And all the people that he went to speak to, like the Tsar, were devout anti-Semites. And he had no problem of talking to them and telling them that he has brought to them the solution for Jewish population in their countries, because he's going to take them away to Palestine. So this is how anti-Semitism was treated then by Zionists, by the prophet of Zionism, by the father of the movement. And this is how they still treat it today. All the anti-Semitic regimes in Europe are the best friends of Israel. Poland and the Polish the state is full of anti-Semitic theorists and practitioners, but they have no problem with Zionism or with the genocide which is now perpetrated by Zionism. So this is the basis. Now, to the question of does Zionism fight anti-Semitism, I really ask all of you, have you any proof that Zionism actually notes real anti-Semitism? Because what we are now considering, not us, but the European, American, and the West, in a sense, this is really the West against the rest. So the West is considering anti-Semitic a behavior which is against Zionism and its crimes. So Ahmed and me are anti-Semites by definition because we're supporting Palestine and we are against Zionism. Zionism has never been and is not now an opponent of real anti-Semitism. In other words, the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. The IHRA has, in a sense, created a new way of thinking about anti-Semitism, and it's not totally new because Zionism itself, and this is the nub of the question, is not Jewish. What is Jewish about settler colonialism? I mean, are Jews the leader of settler colonialism in Europe? Have they led this movement. Some of them, as individuals, have participated in it, of course, and some of them bought and sold slaves because that's what Europeans did. But this is something very alien to Jewish tradition. What is Jewish about ethnic cleansing? What is Jewish about genocide? I mean, Jews suffered genocide. Yes, that is true. But perpetrating genocide is Jewish? Is this the tradition that Jews have held for 2,000 years of living in Europe? I mean, this is bizarre that most Jews, most organized Jews, still support Zionism and support, in a sense, the genocide, because whoever doesn't speak against genocide is supporting it. It's like Nazism. You can't be I don't think I'm for or against Nazism. That position is untenable. Either you're for Nazism or you're against Nazism. The same is true about what is happening in Gaza. Either you're for it or you're against it. You can't be on a non-existing fence here. So that's the last thing I want to say about Jewish tradition of 2,000 years, Jewish experience for 2,000 years, Jewish, understanding of morality for 2,000 years, as it did not agree and could not accept what happened to Jews as just. Of course, it didn't. So how could the Israel, so-called a Jewish state, do what it's doing and justified by Judaism? There is nothing Jewish about the Jewish state. They have hijacked Judaism and converted the minds not just of the leaders of the West, but the minds of Jews who until 1967 in most countries did not support Judaism. So it was a military victory, in a sense, the last military victory of the Israeli army. That's what my book is explaining. And, it was a military change, military might that converted Jews from Judaism to Zionism in Europe and elsewhere. So we can say Zionism is not fighting anti-Semitism. It is not providing Jews with a safe haven. The only place in the world that Jews are killed because they are living there, not because they are Jews, but they are in danger, is Palestine. That is the only place the Jews are hounded in the language of this government that we have now in Jerusalem. And of course, I have to clarify this as a lie. They are not attacked because they are Jewish. They are attacked because they're part of a settler colonial state, which is barbarous, which is brutal, which is illegal, which is immoral, and which is against the Jewish tradition and the Jewish religion.
But on that, Professor Haim, there is still common in the mainstream media that, there is a Jewish state in Israel. It exists. And so the anti-Zionist rhetoric that exists in the Western society is actually considered as a hostility to the Jewish people's right to exist and thrive in the Jewish state of Israel. I mean, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is currently being adopted widely, states that criticizing the state of Israel amounts to questioning this right, and therefore is considered to be anti-Semitic. I mean, should that anti-Zionist rhetoric be considered as anti-Semitic rhetoric because it criticizes the Jewish state of Israel?
I think the opposite is true. The IHRA, which, by the way, the person responsible for has already condemned as a political crude tool to achieve something that he never intended. But like hijacking Judaism, Zionism also hijacked anti-Semitism and weaponized the definition to make it a tool for the Zionist state and its continued brutality. So the idea that if you are, let's look at what it means in reality. In reality, it means that Jews have to support genocide. This is what it means. If you don't support the genocide, you are anti-Semitic, even if you're Jewish yourself. Like I'm a Jew. My family was, my two parents were the only survivors of their family in the Holocaust. Yeah. So we actually suffered personally from anti-Semitism in Europe. And now I am called an anti-Semite. All my friends are called anti-Semites. All the Palestinian people who are supporting the self-determination and rights of Palestinians are called anti-Semites. All the other people on the left who support this are called anti-Semites. This is basically a world upside down. We are fighting. We are struggling for human rights. We are struggling for the rights of the Palestinians to be free, and that is supposedly anti-Semitic. I mean, Jews were denied rights for hundreds of years under anti-Semitic regimes. Is this now, a reckoning that is making sense, that Jews behave in an anti-Semitic way, and yet when they do that, they blame us who are fighting for human rights, who are fighting against genocide. The concept of genocide was developed by a Jew called Lemkin in 1948, and it was made the crime of crimes. How could anyone justify genocide, let alone Jews who suffered from genocide and from anti-Semitism and from a denial of rights for hundreds of years? So this is total nonsense. They have turned anti-Semitism, which in reality they depend on, because anti-Semitism is the recruiting sergeant of Zionism. It is bringing Jews to Palestine for tens of years. Now, of course, if indeed anti-Semitism was so rife in Britain, in France, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand, and in the Anglophone world, but definitely in Europe, if it was so rife, then why are the Jews not kind of all standing up and walking to Palestine? Well, because all of them, including those who attack us as anti-Semites, are not mad and not stupid enough to think that their life in Palestine are going to be safer than their life, for example, in Australia. I mean, Australia is suffering racism for hundreds of years. We know that. You have reminded us of it at the beginning of this meeting. And I think the time will come that meeting like this in Palestine will start with a similar recapitulation of history, that people will say, we have suffered from Zionist oppression and racism for a long time, and now we're free, and we're reminding you of that. So I think this is, Israel, like Australia, like the United States, is a settler colonial state based not on exploiting the natives, but expelling the natives. And if expelling doesn't work, it comes to destruction, which is genocide. This is what we're seeing today. President Trump, a converted anti-Semite into a later day Zionist, is now offering Palestinians for sale to different countries, from the Far East to Egypt and to Jordan. And we've seen Palestinians over the last 48 hours going back to what doesn't exist. Northern Gaza is flattened. Trump himself called it a demolition site. And yet they're going back to those ruins because that is their land, that is their country, that is their home. We should accept it. We should accept it that any Jew who doesn't accept it cannot live in Palestine, no more than a racist should be able to live in Australia. So I don't think the IHRA has ever been intended for anything but fighting anti-Zionists like myself.
You mentioned Zionism thrives on anti-Semitism. You also mentioned settler colonialism. Some say that Jewish trauma and anti-Semitism have been manipulated and weaponized by imperial powers and the Zionist colonial movement to achieve their political and economic ambitions in the Arab world, by creating this Jewish colony in Palestine, the center of the Arab world, as it were. How accurate do you think that is, this abuse of the Jewish trauma or instrumentalization of the Jewish communities in order to achieve these kind of ambitions, imperial ambitions and colonial ambitions in Palestine?
Well, we have to remember that without Britain, there wouldn't be a Jewish state in Palestine today. Since 1916, when Haim persuaded the British cabinet that he can that he does represent an important movement of colonization, and that he can act as a bulwark of Europe in the Middle East, Britain, later France, still later the United States, and now the whole West, without any qualifications, are supporting this colonial movement as part of itself. Indeed, I would say that to be a proper American, you have to be Jewish in some sense, because this is what has been developed, the understanding, and they call it Judeo-Christian. The only Judeo-Christian tradition that I'm aware of is anti-Semitism. There isn't a Judeo-Christian tradition. Jews were rejected by Christianity in different forms since the death of Christ. I mean, if Christ came to life, he would be amazed at the kind of religion that was built on his grave. It's a terrible thing that happened to Christianity. That it moved from a criticism of part of the Jewish tradition to becoming a hater of Jews as the other. So I think we have to be very careful when those claims are made. Those claims are actually, in a sense, what has happened is that not only were the Jewish minds Zionized, they were Zionized, and they were transformed from a religion that was, in a sense, internationalist and cosmopolitan in its tradition. Jews were living everywhere. They belonged everywhere, despite the fact that they were not accepted. They were everywhere in the Western world. They were everywhere in the Muslim world. And they were seeing themselves, they were speaking the languages of the place they lived in. They were part of its tradition, and sometimes they were very important linguistically, artistically, in a literate sense. Jews were, as a very important philosopher mentioned, people of the word. Words were very important for Jews. So they actually were innovators of all forms of literature, the arts, etc., and philosophy. They were not known as militarist and military people in Europe or in the Arab East, of course.
And not
So
just in
I
art,
think
in
this,
physics, in mathematics, and engineering. I mean, massive names in history are actually of Jewish background. Yes.
but of course, this comes from Spain. You're right, Ahmed. This comes from Spain, where, in Spain, under the Muslim rule, for 800 years of Muslim rule, Jews were leading, together with Christians and Muslims, all those developments. Maimonides was writing Hebrew in Arabic script and Arabic in Hebrew script. How, closer can you become to each other when you do that? This is a mark of intimacy, intellectual and emotional intimacy between those groups, that they used each other's scripts to write their language, and vice versa. So there was incredible closeness between the three religions under Islam, and that made it possible to create geography, mathematics, physics, optics, philosophy. We wouldn't even be able to read Aristotle today, but for the years of convivencia that, saved those texts. They saved the plays from Greece that were, junked by Christian churches. Yeah, they saved those texts, they translated them, they taught them. In Muslim thinking of that period, the Greeks were very important. So the ideas of any of the sciences would not exist in the form that they do without that intimacy between the three religions. This is not the situation today. The Jews today have been colonized by Zionism. Their minds have been colonized by Zionism, and the minds of the Western leaders have been colonized by Zionism, in the sense that Zionism is part of Western colonialism. They are an agent of, and that's what Herzl said to all the leaders he spoke to. Let us be your people in the Middle East. We will be, a barrier against the barbarians. This is how he described his mission. It hasn't changed. So instead of saying, the West is the dog and Zionism is the tail, and sometimes the tail wags the dogs, and sometimes the dog is allowed to wag the tail. Actually, the dog is hardly ever allowed to wag the tail, but it is supplying it, it's serving it, it's paying for it, it's supporting it. So Zionism is not a usual tail, and this is not a usual dog. This is a very deep, partnership.
I totally agree with you. And I like the way you put it that, the Jewish brains have been Zionized by this ideology. I mean, you've written this fantastic book, An Army Like No Other, about the structure and the role of the IDF as a structural organization in indoctrinating the minds of the Jewish people. And, you know, so my question to you is, other than providing the military services, what role does the army, the Israeli army, play within the structure of the state? I mean, how is it different from other countries' military establishments? You write in your book that every country has an army, but Israel is an army with a country rather than a country with an army. Can you unpack that for us? What's the role of the IDF as a, quote unquote?
The people who created the IDF, mainly Ben-Gurion, in 1920, had a Prussian idea of the state. About Prussia, people said at the end of the 19th century, all countries have an army, but Prussia is an army that has a state. And Ben-Gurion believed that very deeply. And his own addition to this concept was the whole people is the army. So it's not just the state. The people are the army, and the army are the people. So there is a kind of total identity between those three concepts of the people, the army, the state. In a sense, society is the army. Now, this was not just a philosophical, if you can call it philosophical concept. This was a principle of organization of Zionist society. So the first institution that Zionism is created once Britain is taking over Palestine, and in a sense, even before it gets the mandate, it already is implementing the Balfour Declaration. It starts implementing it the minute it takes over Palestine, and it will only get the mandate in the beginning of the 20s, but it already is implementing Zionism. This is what it means. So Britain was there for 30 years, from 1917 to 1947. It only left in mid-1948. And for those 3 decades, it basically implemented Zionism. Now, what this means is that if Britain allowed Zionism to take over Palestine, it allowed them also to break the law that it itself was supposedly upholding. For example, the Jews and Arabs living in Palestine were not allowed to have military forces. But, the Haganah, created in 1920, at the beginning, before the mandate, was an obviously illegal organization. And later on, the other militias, the Irgun and Lehi, they were all illegal organizations under British mandate law. The Palestinians didn't have an army of that description or any description. So what Britain has allowed is, a double face, which still is the position that the British are taking today. They allowed the Israelis, the Zionists, before Israel, the Zionists to create armed forces, to arm themselves to the teeth, to have an army that was almost a quarter of the population of Jews in Palestine, to have army, activities, because those activities supported the British in supporting Zionism. I'll give you just one important example. In 1936, the Palestinians started the first Intifada, which was called the Arab Rebellion, or all kind of names. But it was basically a demand for self-determination in their own country. They didn't invite the British more than they invited the Turks before. No population is inviting invaders and controllers of their freedom. And they fought it in all ways they could. In 1936, the population started with a general strike that developed into a very decisive action with very little material tools because they didn't have an army, they didn't have the kind of arms that were needed to fight the British. The British, of course, were a world power. It was the biggest empire of the modern world. During the years 1936 to 1939, most of the British army was in Palestine. Now, just remember, please, that Britain had a lot of colonies in 1936. First, India, that was already fighting the British. India is, of course, a small and insignificant country compared to Palestine, but still, you know, it did exist. So India, this huge subcontinent, had like 15% of the British army, while Palestine had 80% or 85% of the British army, because the fight that Palestinians gave to the British army was so efficient that they had to bring many army units from Europe. So when the war starts in 1939, they have to take a lot of army out of Palestine to Europe because they didn't have it in Britain, yeah? And that opposition to British rule could not have won by 1939 without the Zionists, because they actually used the illegal, they were illegal, right? Those militias, Haganah and others, but mainly Haganah, which was the biggest, in killing, you know, the best people in Palestine, the people who fought for freedom. And together they killed in the region between 13 and 15,000 young Palestinians that fought for freedom and for full rights, which they never had, and they still don't. So I think this kind of immoral and indeed illegal by their own measure combining of forces of the Cologne and the colonial power, Britain, is what we see now today with the United States, and indeed with Britain. I mean, Britain is still assisting militarily in ways that are hardly publicized. Britain is flying spy planes as we speak above Palestine. I mean, you would have thought that the Israelis can do their own spying, and indeed they can. But it's very important for them, and it's very important for Britain to work together as colonial partners. So this is a situation which has brought, for example, a very interesting development in Britain. I was arrested for terror, terror actions in November last year, and many of my friends were arrested since under the terror legislation, because we are speaking, not because we're doing any terror activity. We are speaking against genocide. Now, everyone should be against genocide. This is the UN most important piece of legislation. And it says quite clearly that whoever is assisting genocide or not acting against it is themselves a genocider. So we are now, by trying to uphold international law, determined as terrorists, while the real terrorists, the real genociders in the Middle East, Israel, are important partners. And this is, for example, very clear in the case of British Jews, about 2,500 of which fought in Gaza and killed Palestinians as British citizens serving in a foreign army. Now, normal countries, don't allow it in the first place. If you are, one of us, say American or, you can't really be a member of another country's army. But look at it. The British, I don't know about Australia, the British, the American, the French, and some other countries allow only Jews to serve in the Israeli army. Nobody else can serve in a foreign army. So these people who served there and came back to Britain should be in the ICC, should be standing justice as murderers in a genocide. Instead, we are hunted as terrorists while they are very important people. Some of them, a rabbi in the north of England is doing talks all over England about how heroic he was in killing people in Gaza. So these people are fine. There's no problem with genocide. The only problem is with people who fight for human rights. I think this is describing where we are at the moment.
Absolutely. It's a shameful state that we're in. I do want to encourage everyone to start putting the question in, because we're going to start into the Q&A box, because we're going to start taking questions as soon as possible. I do have one last question for you, Professor Haim. I've been fiddling around and wrestling around with this question in my brain. After 15 months of genocide, large proportion of the Israeli soldiers faced psychological challenges, going through rehab. Many of them actually committed suicide. So following the battle they were fighting in Gaza, do you think those soldiers were also fighting an internal battle on the psychological level? I mean, that is a result of decades and decades of indoctrination and brainwashing, a battle between being a Zionist and being a Jewish human being. I don't know why I arrived at that question, because, seeing the scenes coming out from Gaza, the doings of those soldiers. I mean, you mentioned in the book your own story during the 1967 and your father's story as well, battling the idea of joining the IDF. So, I mean, do you think there can ever be a situation, for example, where, the indoctrinated Israeli society will wake up to the true reality and the truth of this system of indoctrination, that the IDF has implemented, and that Zionism has turned them into this kind of, I don't know, beasts, really. I mean, based on what we're seeing in Gaza.
Actually, beasts are not doing things like that. I know we're using the word beastly in English, but beasts are not inhuman. They kill to eat, to exist. There is no cruelty involved in searching food. So beasts are not as bad as humans. Humans are excelling in cruelty. Now, just at the bottom of this question, Ahmed, is, and I think it's the most important question to ask, because it's a question about how do you become a Nazi? How do you become a genocider if you believe in any religion? Because any religion that I know is against genocide. The Israeli army, and this is what my book is about, is not like any other army. It is an army so ideologically invested in colonialism, but also in holding the society together as a modern Sparta, that you can't compare it to the British Army. The British Army is paid, is professional. The American Army is paid and professional. The French Army, etc. So people who want to be in the army go and not exactly volunteer, they work as soldiers. Now, in Israel, this is not the case. This is a draft army, most men, and now quite a lot of women as well. I think probably by now most women serve in the army. As a result of Zionist feminism, the women in Israel demand to be equal with the men. In other words, to be in the fighting units. This is the face of Zionist feminism. It's a really very sad face of any feminism to be so militaristic as to demand the full rights to be a genocider. So the army in Israel is basically what held the country together even before it became a country called Israel. It held the society together. It was the first, as I said, of all institutions to create it in 1920. The university started operating in Jerusalem in the end of the 20s, but the army was created in 1920. So basically, this is the most important institution in Israel. It's the biggest club that everyone belongs to. In that sense, it's democratic. And I want to say that the genocide in Israel, in Gaza, is a democratic genocide. 96 to 97% of Israeli Jews have supported what is happening in Gaza, though some of them, about half, said that it's not cruel enough. They didn't use the word, but they said we should be harder on the Palestinians. So this army, at the time that my father was refusing to serve in the army when he left Auschwitz and came to Israel with a baby, meaning myself, he didn't want to fight in the army. He was in jail, held because he did not want to fight. And in the end, he did, because they said he didn't fight. He was a medic. He refused to have arms, and he treated people and saved their life. So this is the army that also taught Hebrew, for example. My father learned Hebrew in the army. He knew Hebrew from the prayer book, but he didn't know modern Hebrew. The army started teaching Hebrew in 1948 to the many people that came from the Arab world, and especially from the camps, the death camps in Europe. The army actually made the states. The people running Israel, and still today running Israel, are the ex-officers. You know the names, you know about Dayan, you know about Sharon, all these generals have run the country, still run the country. And I don't know about any other country that there are so many generals sitting in its parliament and its cabinet and its important institutions. This army is also a financial basis of the economy, because producing arms, testing arms, and using arms is the mainstay of the economy in Israel. At the moment, we hear a lot about American arms, but actually Israel is selling arms to about 150 nations, including China. So the main industry in Israel is the military-industrial academic complex, and I'm adding academic to it because the academy is very much part of the military-industrial complex. So, even in the area of theater, cinema, and entertainment, the army is leading because it has troops to entertain the troops. And those are there since 1948. you know, normal training for the theater and for the cinema for an actor is to be in one of those troops. They have media of their own, written and broadcast, and that is the training ground for people working in the media as well. They have publishing houses that publish all kind of fiction, non-fiction, theory, you know, you name it. They are doing it. So this is not an army like, you know, you can't imagine what I said now about the British army or the Australian army. What are you talking about? This is something else. This is much closer to, say, the system, not necessarily of the army in Germany under Nazism, because the Reichstag was held at some kind of distance. But the SS and SD and SA, the militarized organization of the party. And this was the model that was used in creating this kind of army. So that is not just an army that fights wars. That's an army that runs the country, but runs the minds. So those young people who are committing suicide, I'm not happy about it. But in a sense, they should all commit suicide because they're all, you know, killing children, killing women, killing men that are not armed. This is what Israel has excelled at. Not at fighting armies, especially not fighting small forces like Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis. They can't really win against such forces, but they can't actually fight without the whole technology that allows them to kill from the air, to kill from their homes, to kill from under the ground in some, you know, 100 or 1,000 miles away. But of course, they also kill by hand. Yeah, they kill with guns in Gaza, and they are in the futuristic landscape of Gaza that we all know. Even little children now see it on their telephones. So this is not just a very democratic genocide. No one asked the Germans to agree to the genocide against the Jews. They just took it for granted that they wouldn't do anything. And it was very secret, but this is not a secret. The Israelis are actually killing and singing and dancing and performing the genocide to a global audience. So we don't need to actually do a lot. I mean, you just record what they are broadcasting. You can bring them to the ICC. They are very proud of what they're doing. So the majority is proud of what they're doing. A minority is committing suicide. More than 10,000 people are now incarcerated in mental institutions. And you know what? Killing is not normal. Killing is not good for you. And this is the proof. So I think that is the sign that the Sparta that they have, you know, kind of technological modern Sparta that they have developed cannot exist. Not only cannot it defeat the people of the land, but it cannot exist even for the benefit of Jews in Israel or elsewhere. It is not a normal animal, and there is no such animal in any zoo. In the political zoo of humanity, Israel is standing alone, and it's not a very, you know, good situation to be in.
Absolutely. I mean, no matter how hard you try to sympathize the core human element, it's just the indoctrination is so potent and the cruelty is just boundless, unfortunately. I do want to start with the Q&A session. There's a question here I want to start with. Please address the significance of the Stalinist USSR collaboration with Zionism after June 1941, its support public support for Zionism from May 1947, its role in getting a majority for the 29th of November 1947 UN vote for petition, the role of weapons supplied by the Czechoslovakia in the Zionist victory in 1948, and the promotion of the Jewish migration to Palestine and Israel.
All that the questioner mentioned is correct, but let us just examine it in context. The Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union has just fought a very bitter war against Nazism. And in this war, a lot of Jews partook. I mean, my uncle was, a communist. The brother of my father was a communist, and he was an officer in the tank force in the USSR for the whole war. Many other people in the family also fought in the Soviet ranks. So Jews fought like others. I mean, you didn't have to be a communist to fight the Nazis, but of course, if you were, you had two reasons to fight them: A, because they killed communists, and B, because they killed Jews, normally in the same camps. So the Jewish population in the Soviet Union was totally integrated during those years. And the only communist the only communist party of note was the one of Palestine in the Middle East. And like somewhere else, mostly in the Middle East, Jews were there at its birth. They were the people who started it together normally with Christians, Armenians mainly, and the majority Muslims. So the Jewish-led Communist Party of 1948 was a very pale shadow of the Communist Party of Palestine before, because before it was mainly a force of Palestinians. Some of the leadership was Jewish indeed. And that was a tension within the Communist Party. I don't have time to speak about that, but there's a number of books about this, some of them by my friend Musa Budeiri, a Palestinian that wrote the history of that movement and explained how the majority of Jewish communists were Zionists. And they couldn't see the problem with being a communist and a Zionist. And they had connections, obviously, in the Soviet Union and in other countries controlled by the Soviet Union. So the Soviets saw this Communist Party as some kind of progressive force, which it wasn't after 48. It was before, but it wasn't after 48, because those communists helped to arm, as the questioner pointed out. The arm came from Czechoslovakia, and were communist arms produced in the the USSR and in Czechoslovakia, and that was in a sense a conduit to modern arms, the most important one that Israel used. So everyone who knows the history would blame Stalin for supporting Israel or supporting in the UN the creation of a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. But that's what they voted for. They voted for a Jewish state and a Palestinian state side by side. The resolution was flawed very deeply and created an Nakba and created everything that we see today. But that resolution accepted that Palestinians have a right for self-determination, mainly because of the communist insistence. The main support for Zionism did then and does now come from the West. This is the West against the rest on this, like on any other topic. So yes, true. The Soviet Union erroneously supported the creation of a Jewish state because they believed the Jews have a right for self-determination. I don't believe that that was the right decision, because this is not self-determination. This is colonial occupation and genocide. And you can have self-determination, and the Soviets allowed Jewish self-determination in part of the Soviet Union. There was a Jewish Yiddish state, a republic. So the Soviets believed in that, and that's what they allowed in the Soviet Union itself. And they thought that those Jews that ended up in Palestine have a right to exist as Jews. But it's not really about existing as Jews. This is existing as colonialists. We talked about this before. So yes, we should recognize this as a terrible mistake, especially giving most of the country to the Jewish state and giving the majority population, which is also indigenous and was about 70% of the people in Palestine, only 45% of the land. So whichever way you look at what happened in 47, it was the worst mistake that anybody could make. And the Palestinians are still paying the price, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I do have many questions here, but we'll try to kind of wrap them all up if we can by 8:30 or 11:30 your time. But I do want to merge a couple of questions quickly, Professor Haim. So can you talk a little bit more about your statement that Trump is offering Palestinians for sale to other countries? So the listener found it a bit not understandable. And in general, I mean, given the Trump's administration, is there a possible solution for the Palestinians on the horizon?
I'm sorry that my kind of Jewish sense of humor and irony is misunderstood, but that's what I meant. I mean, he's offering the Palestinians for free. He's actually not offering, but ordering, bearing in mind the power relations. He's ordering Egyptians and the Jordanians, and also some of his ministers and advisors mentioned that the whole of the Palestinian population should be in Indonesia. They have failed to ask either the Palestinians or the Indonesians if this plan is agreed by them. But that's how, colonialism and imperialism operate. They are now, Trump is known for having said not 2 weeks ago that, I just learned that Israel is too small. Now, I think the only thing that is too small is the brain of Trump. But basically, he has just learned, as he said, that Israel is too small. How did he learn that? Of course, he was told that by Netanyahu. Israel is too small is another language of Greater Israel. And Greater Israel, depending who you ask, is either from the Euphrates to the sea. This is one other river from the river to the sea. That's the version of the river to the sea that Zionism, the river from the river to the sea is a Zionist maxim. It started with Zionism, not with the Palestinians. And the other version is from the river to the river, which is from the Euphrates to the Nile. So this is, Zionist thinking. Now there is another river involved, the Litani River in Lebanon, and that's also included as another northern border. So this is what they are thinking of. This is what they are planning. This is what they want. And you will note that Israel is the only country that has no borders. There has never been borders. There were, ceasefire lines. That's what they were. What the green lines is the line of where the war ended. But it was never a border, and Israel never saw it as a border. And it still does not see what it controls now, which is the whole of Palestine, as a border. It controls part of Syria, which has grown recently, as you know. It wishes to control parts of Sinai, and it did in the past. And it actually would be very happy to control Jordan and to eject the population of Jordan to another place. So this is what we're talking about. When Trump is saying Israel is not big enough, that's what he means. He means those three rivers, the Euphrates, the Litani, and the Nile, as the pro tem borders. I don't want to, I want to give a chance for other questions, but I think that's clear.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for that. So a question I'm keen on you answering, Professor Haim. How was Israel accepted in to the UN, as it has never declared fixed borders, which is one of the requirements for memberships?
Thanks a lot. I'm very glad that you asked me that, Ahmed, because I'm a supporter of the ejection of Israel from the UN. And one country was already ejected from the UN in 1973. It was apartheid South Africa. And it was ejected because it was an apartheid legality. It was a legal entity with apartheid. Of course, Israel is a much greater, much worse apartheid state than South Africa ever was. And South Africa did not commit genocide. It committed ethnic cleansing, but not genocide. So if there was a reason to eject South Africa from the General Assembly in 1973, there are 100 reasons to eject Israel from the UN. And some of those reasons are very simple. In Resolution 194, that was accepted by the UN at the beginning of 1949, after the war was concluded between the Arab sides and Israel, the UN demanded, that's the language, not requested, but demanded that the Palestinian refugees are all allowed to return home, to their homes, to their fields, to their towns and villages, and that this is conditioned on the membership of Israel in the UN. Now, we know what happened. Israel refused, rejected, denied, and did not accept any resolution since 194, and have hence broke the deal of membership, because it didn't and it doesn't have borders. And if you are a country without borders, you cannot be a member of the UN. You cannot be a member of the UN as a genocide country, and you cannot be a member of the UN as an apartheid country. Israel ticks all the boxes. So if you want illegal reasoning, there it is. We are using this argument. We are populating this argument. You will be able to read an article by myself and a colleague of mine from Palestine in the Electronic Intifada next week, I hope, about the same thing. This was demanded by the rapporteurs, including Francesca Albanese and people before her, as the minimum sanction that the UN can operate against Israeli apartheid originally, because she and the others wrote before the genocide we're now seeing. But of course, the genocide, as I said, started in the 30s. So even genocide is not new. But yes, I agree with the question wholeheartedly.
Absolutely. And there was a email campaign actually initiated by BDS movement demanding the UN to expel Israel. And I can share the link with everyone shortly via email. It's really important email to do. I'm going to go and do another 2 questions, if you don't mind, Professor, and then we can wrap it up. So my question is this conflict in Gaza a turning point for Israel? How that the world sees what is happening? Do you think global support for Israel will plummet?
Well, global support for Israel, start from that point, has already plummeted to the lowest point in its history. Most of humanity, billions of humanity, live in countries which are opposed to what Israel is doing. The populations of those countries, not in the Arab and Muslim East alone, but everywhere. And there are a lot of Muslims, It's the second largest group on earth. But you don't have to be a Muslim to understand that this genocide is terrible. You have to be a human. So most of humanity has lost any time it had ever had for Israel. Israel has expelled itself from human society. And we know what needs to be done when a country does that. The least you can do is eject it from human society represented by the UN. And the most you can do is all kind of sanctions, including military sanctions. But at least a proper international protection force for the Palestinians, because at the moment, the Palestinians have no protection either by law or by force or by sanction or by any form of human behavior. There is a law that requires Israel to return the Palestinians, but there is no way of enforcing this law, for example, the Resolution 194. So I think that what we're talking about is Israel as a society, as a socialist, as a colonial society is now at an end in the sense that its decline is very fast. As a society, it is declining. As an economy, it is declining. As a military force, it is in deep decline. And so you look at different aspects that you wish to choose. They are also in decline or in fall, actually. That this army, which supposedly is the 4th strongest army on earth, is unable to actually fight people who are fighting with light arms against its heavy machinery, technologized and so on, is a sign of, another aspect of that decline of Zionism. Zionism already has lost 800,000 Israelis, or more probably by now, that have left the country. What does this tell you? Does this tell you that Israelis think they have a future in Palestine? I don't think so. So this is a process that has started. I want to end by saying that the decline of Israel is part of the decline of the West. The decline of the West and the decline of Israel is the most dangerous time. Decline of empire is the dangerous time. That is the time that the empires become brutal, become uncalculated, become suicidal in some cases. Yeah. And I think Israel has now declared a war on the Middle East. It is already bombed quite a few countries and quite a few populations, and is planning to do some more with the backing of Trump. And I can't see how Trump can produce any better results in the Middle East than he did for the environment, than he did for equality, than he did for anything that culturally is necessary for humans to exist together. Trump is basically not just a fascist, but misogynist, a racist, anything that has an ist almost on its ending, he fits. So basically, anyone that is looking to Trump for solutions, we already have those solutions. Egypt, Jordan, and of course, people were talking about Africa, Congo, Canada, anything starts with a C, Indonesia, basically the moon. Yeah, I mean, if we could reach the moon, the Palestinians will be put there. This is the kind of solution that Trump Musk line is now putting out for us to accept. This is not normal, but normality now is very questionable. If the West is normal, then humanity is finished, and the life on Earth is finished, and the life not just of humans, but of all life on Earth, because this is the kind of political understanding that is now running the West.
I mean, it seems like you're linking Zionism to empire. I do want to end on like an encouraging note or a hopeful note, although, I mean, it looks a bit gloomy ahead with Trump in power. I mean, what are the strategies that we need to adopt to kind of accelerate the dismantlement of Zionism, dismantle this system of support by the imperial powers, by the Western powers to Zionism and to Israel? What can we do in our capacity moving forward?
Very briefly, what a number of us are suggesting, and you will note that the people who are foreseeing the collapse of Zionism, in other words, in the future, and not necessarily the near future of tomorrow, but in the foreseeable future, are people who normally don't talk about the future, but talk about the past. In other words, historians like myself. Yeah, so it's Ilan Pape and myself and Avi Shleim and Nur Masalcha and Rashid Khalidi and so on. I mean, historians are now speaking about the future. They're speaking about the future because they read the past onto the future, yeah, like a pattern, and they can see where this is going from where we were. And we are now saying this is now started coming apart, and yeah, we need to help it. Every empire collapses from within, but with help from outside. That terms the timing. The collapse really is an internal collapse. It is no longer able to operate like apartheid South Africa or the Nazi regime or even the Soviet Union. So it all starts from inside. We need to help it. To help it would be to accept that Israel is not part of the human race, and Israel, not its people necessarily, though its people are supporting of the regime in the ways that I've described. But Israel as a state, as a society organized to kill and to expel and to commit terrible war crimes, that is finished. Now, how do we get that? We eject it from the UN. How do we eject it from the UN? Most of the members of the UN are open to this idea, like they were in 1973. They are frightened of Trump. They should be frightened of Trump because he's not all there. And America, the empire, is behind all this. We've talked about that. We have to support BRICS and to get BRICS to be a progressive force. It isn't at the moment. I'm saying this clearly. It isn't at the moment with people like Modi leading India. It isn't at the moment with Russia not being the progressive force that it should have been. But we have what we have, and we have to work with that, and we have to democratize and to humanize BRICS. And I think that is probably a possibility. BRICS is not a single force like the empire, but it's a force of multi-centers, and that holds some potential. And I hope that China is will take a leading role in making this happen. If the hope is anywhere, that's where it is, in weakening the empire to a point that it cannot cause global harms, cannot cause global harms to the Palestinians or to any other nation in the way that it has for so many decades or centuries even. And it can't cause harm to the environment, and it can't cause the harm that it does at the moment. At the moment, this is a point of change. Trump is not operating through pretense like Joe Biden, genocide Joe, in our terms. Trump is going to speak about it as a business, but he's not better or worse than Joe Genocide. He's a supporter of this, but his terminology and his actions are different. But his ministers already said that if the ICC continues the action against Israel, the judges will be taken by American soldiers to Guantanamo. I mean, this is the kind of normality we can expect from the Trump regime. So if you ask me, am I brimming with happiness about him coming to power and expecting the best? No, I'm not. But it's a struggle. It has always been a struggle for Palestinians. They are used to it. They are frightened like the rest of us, but they are hopeful. And you saw the people coming back from the south to North Gaza. This is a strong people. This is a humane people. This is a people that wants freedom and merits everything, every right that they can get, they will fight for and they will get. So my own corner of hope and optimism is based on the Palestinian people and all those others like us who see them and who know that we must support them to support our own freedom. This is what Nelson Mandela has told us, that none of us is free until Palestine is free. What a wise understanding does this represent? And it's very, very important that we operate on it. The other thing I want to say in closing is that instead of coming with solutions to Gaza, which are taking those people out of Gaza in order to build there another Qatar with, money from the Gulf and decisions from the United States and Israel, what we should do is something very simple. Put a united, get Israel out of the UN, vote for a force to be put in Israel to protect the Palestinians, and there to rebuild Gaza with the Palestinians, for the Palestinians, by the Palestinians. The West should pay to restitute what it has destroyed. This is a Western project, the destruction of Gaza and the destruction of Palestine. They should pay for it, but the rebuilding is for Palestinians to decide and to do. And while they are waiting for Gaza to be rebuilt as a symbol of the new Palestine, they should be allowed into the rest of Palestine, where there is the infrastructure to support them, where this is their country. Most of the people in Gaza are not originally from Gaza, but from other parts of Palestine. And these will not only bring the end of Zionism, but will bring a future of life together, a new convivencia. The only way that Palestinians will be able to accept living with Israelis is if those Israelis will help to rebuild life in Palestine. Otherwise, there will not be a place for Israeli Jews in Palestine, because they will be seen as genociders. And I don't think I want this. I don't think Palestinians want this. Palestinians have offered all Jews to live in equality, in justice, not in genocide, not in ethnic cleansing. If Jews in Israel, who are not, in a sense, Jews, they are Israelis, if they understand this and work for it, Palestine, the new Palestine, will be quite a place to live in, and probably an example for the Arab world. I think that's what we need to hope for, and that's what we need to work for. Anyone that wants to hold on to racism in the Jewish population might look for another place where racism is welcome. I don't know of such a place, but probably they can find one somewhere in the United States. I don't think they will be welcome by most Americans, but I don't know where racism of that type is today welcome. Maybe in India. I don't think many other places.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. The return of that convivencia that you mentioned cannot happen without the eradication of Zionism, that supremacist, racist ideology. And therefore, we have a lot of work to do. Whether Trump is in power or Genocide Joe in power, we need to intensify our campaigning, our activism, until we get to that end goal for the Palestinians and for us as well in the West and, North and global North, global South, and so on and so forth. I couldn't get enough of you, Professor Haim. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us today. And I want to thank everyone also for joining us in this incredible educational session. A couple of comments. The video recording of this session will be sent out to everyone who is registered. And I also want to thank everyone who donated today. This webinar was free to register and attend, but many people have generously donated, and all the donations will go to Gazan families that I'm in touch with. And finally, I want to thank everyone again for joining us today, and stay tuned for our next webinar. We're gonna be talking to Dr. Salman Abu Sitta. So stay tuned and keep checking your inbox. Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Professor Haim.
Thank you. And Dr. Salman Abu Sitta is a dear friend, and I'm sure you will learn a lot from him. He is the wisest and most experienced Palestinian I know. Enjoy. Thank
Yeah,
you
I
very
look forward to
much.
that. I look forward to that conversation. You're all like encyclopedia. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye.